Please help me welcome Barbara Lamb.
I am very, very pleased to be here from San Diego. That's where I live now. And I've heard about your group and the wonderful things that you do and the wonderful speakers you have. And I'm very pleased to be with a group of people who are very open-minded, right? Do you consider yourselves open-minded and curious and investigating and wondering about things? Well, I think that's great, and that's how I've always been as well. So I love being with people who are like that. I just wonder now, how many of you have put any attention at all into the subject of extraterrestrial beings? Whoa, that's wonderful. Good for you. I saw many, many hands go up. I'll explain just quickly how I got into this very unusual aspect of my work. I am a continuing psychotherapist, licensed back in 1976, so that's a lot of years of doing that. But in the 1980s, I began 5 years of training in past life regression therapy. And that was a wonderful adventure in itself. And I still do a lot of past life regressions to get back to the source of people's problems or things that they particularly wonder about. But in 1991, something different happened. A young woman came to me for regression work, and she had been very, very traumatized by unusual beings coming into her room at night and taking her away for a while. And sometimes they would come during the daytime if she was alone at home. And this poor young woman, lovely, lovely young girl, she was so traumatized by these unusual beings. She didn't understand what was going on, who they were, or what they wanted, and they were sort of creepy looking from her point of view. And so she had dropped out of college, and she had dropped out of her part-time job and was insisting on sleeping between her mother and her father in their bed. And after a year or so of that, they were getting pretty tired of that and thought, oh my goodness, we really need to get help with this situation. So she came for regression work, starting out, as I said, very traumatized, extremely bothered by the whole thing. And I certainly can understand that. And we did, over a period of time, we did 6 regressions to get through the details of those experiences. And it was like reliving each one of those encounters, which she, by the way, only knew the first very few moments of, which is typical for people who experience these encounters. They're usually aware of just the first few seconds of the encounters, and then they seem to be, we call it switched off. In other words, put out of consciousness of the rest of the experience that unfolds. So that's why the regression work is so helpful, to find out all the details that they did not consciously remember or even know about as it was happening. So I found through that the subconscious part of the mind is a really wonderful thing. I think it's great that we have that aspect of our minds, because the subconscious part of the mind records absolutely everything, every moment of our experiences in life, even those experiences that we're not consciously aware of. So it's like we have this little storehouse there in our consciousness. And if we want to find the details of things that have happened to us that we don't remember consciously, we can do that through this process of hypnotic regression. So with this particular young woman, we did 6 different regressions in 6 separate sessions and found out what was happening with these beings. In each one of those sessions, 2 different experiences, she was confronted with various kinds of beings. It never was the same kind of being each time, and different things were going on. So basically, she was taken away, usually to a spacecraft, a UFO, and various procedures were done. And we discovered during that work that one time she had a very bad ear infection, which of course she knew about in her life. It was really, really painful. And so one night she was in bed sleeping, and the beings came and sort of rolled her over on her left side and began working on her right ear, the one that was badly infected. And she was aware of that for a few moments, that she was being rolled over, and there were 3 tall, thin, white beings, really white, and they were working on her ear. She was conscious for some of that, and then she was not conscious for the rest of it. And she wasn't aware that they had left at a certain period of time. But when she woke up in the morning, all that ear pain was gone. She was completely healed of that ear infection. So at that point, that was probably about our 4th regression out of 6. At that point, she began to think, there's something actually good about some of these encounters. Maybe I don't need to be so fearful about this. And then we went on and over a couple more weeks and did 2 more regressions. And then the 7th session, this young woman came in, and she was all smiles, and she seemed very relaxed. And she said, I've decided that I am very privileged. I am lucky that I am having these encounters with these unusual beings. And now I feel so okay about it that I'm going to not only leave my parents' bed, but leave my parents' house and move into a little cabin in the wilderness behind the town where she lived, which was Upland, California, up in just past the eastern end of LA County. And she said, my boyfriend and I are going to move into a little cabin in the wilderness in the foothills, and I feel perfectly okay about that. And I said, well, of course, these encounters are probably going to continue. You've had them all your life, and there's no reason to think that they would stop just because you move. And she said, I know, I figured that out, and my boyfriend and I are both okay with that if it happens, if it continues to happen. In fact, I would welcome it. So I thought, wow, this work really can help people who are traumatized and having these extraterrestrial encounters. So then at that point, I thought, well, if anybody ever comes, any other people happen to come in the next number of years, I feel confident now that I could really be helpful with this. And so a few more months went by, and I went to England to do my annual crop circle research and wasn't thinking too much about this particular subject. But when I came back again at the end of the summer, another person came, another young woman, and she worked with me for 11 years, and we did probably 50 or 60 regressions, each one to a different extraterrestrial encounter that she had had. So that was pretty amazing. And she also channeled an extraterrestrial being who said he was from the binary star system, which we call Antares. It's actually on our star maps. So that gave me a lot of information about various beings, extraterrestrial beings, and the kinds of things that they do with people, positively and negatively, depending on the type of beings and their agendas. And then another woman came, and another, and make a long story short, it's been almost 2,000 individuals now whom I've had the privilege of regressing to extraterrestrial experiences. So that's a lot, a lot of exposure to this and a lot of information that I've learned about them. And I certainly have concluded, there'd be no way not to, that there are many, many different kinds of extraterrestrial beings who do come here to Earth and interact in various ways with human beings. There probably are many more extraterrestrial species beyond that who may not come to Earth, but I think it's extraordinary that so many do come. One of the hybrids, I will be talking about that this afternoon, said that she knew of 89 different extraterrestrial species, all really very different types from each other and from different planets, different locations. 89 different types of species that come here and interact with humans. So we can't just lump it all in to one type of being. Sometimes I meet a new person who hasn't thought too much about this phenomenon, and the person will say, well, what are the extraterrestrials like, or what are the aliens like? And I'll say, well, it depends on which ones you're talking about, because there are so many different types. But I think that a lot of people out there in the public have the idea that there are little gray aliens and that's it. Or some of them may have the idea there are little gray aliens and there are reptilians and that's it. Or there are little gray aliens and reptilians, and then there are some that look like Nordic human beings. And that's true, there are those three major types, but there are many, many other types as well. And very shortly, I will be showing you a lot of pictures of various types of beings that people have had artists draw, or they've drawn them themselves, people who've experienced these different types. So you will see from what I'm going to show that there is really quite a variety. And some people will say, oh, aren't they all just terrible, and don't they do awful things, and people are just terrified? Well, there are some like that who seem to be more self-serving. I think that's a decent way to say it, rather than mean and horrible. Let's call them more self-serving. They're doing a lot of research on human beings. And so one of the things that, of course, they're very interested in is our physiology. So they will, some of them, do some physical examinations, poking and probing, and in some cases taking skin samples, hair samples, fingernail samples, toenail samples, and so forth. And then they're trying to understand the human beings and how we physiologically work. We would do that too, I think, if we went to another planet and saw a whole different kind of being. I think at least some of us humans would want to know, oh, how do they work? What are they like inside? What's their bone type, their blood type, and what's their digestive system? What's their reproductive system? We would be, I think, very interested, at least the medically inclined humans would want to do that. So I don't think that's unusual that there would be some species who really want to learn about us. And some of them really do a lot of healing work with humans. And there are all kinds of methods of healing that are done by various beings that have come out in some of the regressions that I have done. Healing with light, sometimes like a roll of light, sometimes beams of light coming down, sometimes laser beams of light crossing from different points in the room or through the human body to heal certain conditions. And then, of course, laying on of hands, like we do here, Reiki healers. There are many different types of healings that these beings do, like even the ones I mentioned working in the young woman's ear. She could actually feel them doing something in her ear, which healed it. And anyway, they have lots of different methods of healing. And some of the beings even will take a human being and teach that human being how to do healing. Even if that person has not been a healer before, that person will be taught healing techniques so that they can do that when they come back here to Earth and heal fellow human beings or heal animals or whomever they want to heal. One of the things that came out from that second woman whom I worked with for 11 years, and I love this, what I'm going to tell you. This woman had she had two little boys when I first knew her, and they were about 3 years old. They were twins, fraternal twins. One of the little boys was taken very frequently, at least once a week, and sometimes more frequently, by the beings he called his space friends. He loved those space friends, those extraterrestrials. From what we could gather from what he said, those were looking like the typical gray aliens with the big black eyes and slanting upwards, and they were sort of grayish, palish skin, and they were small, and big heads and little bodies. But he absolutely loved them, and he had names for them. It was the same beings that took him on every occasion when he was taken. And he looked forward to it, and he was happy every morning after one of these experiences. Guess what, Mommy? They came and took me again. I was with my space family. And he had little space friends, little children, who turned out, eventually we realized, were little E.T. human hybrid children living on the spaceship. So this little boy was having these great experiences and so enthused about them. And his twin brother said, "Oh, why don't they take me? Could you please arrange it to have them take me too?" Because such wonderful reports had been given to him by the twin brother who was taken. Anyway, I don't think he ever did get that experience of being taken, but this one, the first one I'm talking about, did over and over again. he also had a cousin, a little girl. She was about a year younger. So when he was 3.5 and talking very verbally, he was a very bright little kid. The little cousin at about age 2.5, she was also bright and talking quite a bit at 2.5, and she was taken as well. However, they were taken by different beings and never saw each other in those experiences. But one day, when they were 3.5 and 2.5, they both woke up at their own separate houses. The mothers lived about a mile away from each other. And the little girl said to her mother, "Guess what, Mommy? I got to go with my cousin to the spaceship." And it was not the spaceship I usually go on, but it was a different one. It was the one he always goes on. And that same morning at the other house, the little boy cousin said, "Guess what, Mommy? I went on the spaceship and she went with me. That was the first time, the only time she's ever come on my spaceship." And he said she sat on, well, she had called I think this is so cute, she had named the extraterrestrials who took them. He called them the Namans. And the mother never knew if he had made up that name or if they had given him that name to know them by. But he said, "Mr. and Mrs. Naaman took me, and she, the cousin, sat on Mr. Naaman's lap when he was piloting the ship, and she fell off and she bumped her head." Well, at about the same time, the cousin in her house was saying, "Guess what? I got to go with him on his spaceship last night, and I sat on Mr. Naaman's lap, and I fell off and I bumped my head." And so the two stories really jived beautifully. Those two kids, at that very young age, 2.5 and 3.5, were already being taught healing with their hands, a process that seems very similar to what we know of as Reiki healing. And so one day, they were having lunch, the two little kids, having lunch with the mother of the little boy, the experiencer mother, and she cut her hand very badly with a paring knife right in that webby point between the forefinger and the thumb, and it was just gushing with blood and, of course, very painful. And the two little kids hopped down from their lunch stools, and they immediately, without saying anything, went into what looked to her to be like Tai Chi types of movements, and she could feel all this warmth coming from their hands and right toward her hand that was bleeding profusely. And she could feel the warmth. It was wonderful. And she could see, as they were doing these movements and sending energy with their hands, little kids, that she could see that the bleeding was stopping very quickly and that everything was beginning to knit together. And she said, "What are you doing?" And one of the little kids said, "Oh, we're just doing our space Reiki. Our space friends have been teaching us how to do this." What a wonderful thing. So she watched, they kept on moving, sending the energy. She watched as it knit up and the bleeding stopped and began to form a scar. I saw her the next day after that event, and she came in for her session with me, and I just saw a little white line, a little white scar. It had already healed to that extent. So isn't that wonderful that these kids were taught healing modalities, and it was very, very effective. Many people in their adult life, those are the only two children I personally know of who were taught healing, but many, many adults are, by some of the extraterrestrial beings, are taught healing skills and use them. In fact, one woman, different woman now, who had been climbing up the corporate ladder in a big company, I think it was one of the big telephone companies in the San Fernando Valley, and she came for a number of regression sessions. And suddenly in her career, during the time I knew her, she left the corporate ladder. She was rising up on quite effectively at about age 35 or so at the time. She left it to go into healing, physical healing with her hands. And she kind of wondered why she felt so strongly that she had to take the chance of earning her living by healing, because she had not earlier in her life thought about healing or knew she had any ability to do that. And so we did some regressions, a series of regressions, and in a couple of the regressions to more recent experiences, she was with extraterrestrial beings who were teaching her to do what they said was called energy code point healing. I had never heard that phrase before or since, as a matter of fact, but that's what they called it. So she was, in her extraterrestrial experiences, which she knew she was having, but she didn't know the details of them, which is typical, didn't know them consciously, but we found out in the regressions that she had been being taught healing skills, a particular method, and she had not consciously known that at the point when she decided to leave the corporate job and go into healing. She just knew she had to do that and couldn't explain it to anybody. Her parents were worried, how's she going to earn a living? How is that going to be reliable? But gosh, I did those regressions with her in the mid-1990s, and she still successfully has a practice and a whole clinic of doing this hands-on healing taught by the extraterrestrials. She also, just to be sure, took a long healing course with Barbara Brennan back in New York. Did the healing with lighted hands. It has a name similar to that. Just to have a certification so people would trust her in her healing, but she already knew the basic techniques from the extraterrestrials. Well, I could go on. I have hundreds, probably thousands of stories about wonderful things that people have had, and some scary things, some disturbing things, but nobody I know out of these almost 2,000 people, and many more regressions, because some of them had quite a number of regressions, never have I been aware of anybody being harmed or ruined in any way by the extraterrestrials, even those that seem a little bit more cold-hearted, lack of feeling, lack of empathy. Some are very caring, and some just seem to not have any emotion at all. And those, of course, are not as pleasant to have encounters with. Well, I'm going to show a lot of pictures now of various types of extraterrestrials, and I will make some comments about them as we go along. So could we have the slides now? So this is the environment we're talking about, a huge universal environment. We think of ourselves on Earth as being this beautiful planet just way off in space and separated from everything else, but we're not really that separated. Okay, I begin with this particular picture because very often an encounter will happen with people driving along. It's not only when they're asleep at night, it can happen in any situation. One of these experiences can begin. And sometimes people are driving along and they begin to realize that very often they'll be aware that there is a beam of light coming from above, coming into the car through the rear mirror or the windshield or one of the side windows. And in any event, the car will begin to sort of slow down. The motor will begin to peter out. And the person, hopefully, usually is able to drive off the road, or certainly to the side of the road for safety, thinking, oh, the car motor is dying out here. And it does die out, it turns off. And then they will often see an area of light. What was light above them is now down at their level. Might be off the road to the side, might be in a woods if there's a woods there. It might be straight ahead. And then, after a few moments, they will typically see beings like these three beings with light behind them, and the beings might be just sort of milling around, or they might be coming toward the person, and then the encounter begins. And it's interesting to me that even if the car doors are locked, the beings have a way of just opening the door. I don't know how they do that, but I had that happen to me, and I am sure that I had locked the doors of the car. But they get in, and then they take the person out, and how they do that, it's almost as if they float them out. You know, there's no struggle. Even if you're seat belted in, they seem to know how to handle that and take the person out and toward the light, and then the light is coming from the craft, the UFO, and then into the UFO for the experience. Or sometimes, as it's happened a couple of times with people who've come to me for this work, one person will be taken from the car and the others are not. The others are switched off. They're out of consciousness. So I know of a situation where there was a family driving along on Route 395 going up to Bishop and Mammoth up there in California, and a UFO came up over the rise of the hill. The car came to a stop. One person from the family was taken, and the rest of them, were about 4 others, family members in the same car, and they just were switched off, just out of consciousness while the one was taken. And eventually the one was brought back and everybody kind of came to, almost like a feeling of waking up again, not knowing what had happened. None of them knew, and went on their way wondering, gee, why is it 2 hours later than we thought it would be by now? So that's one of the clues, by the way, of course, is that if you have missing time for an hour or two, and there have been some other things that you've sensed that were out of the ordinary, you may very well have had one of these encounters. So this is a very typical looking type, one of the gray types of beings. In fact, gray, in regard to one species, is spelled G-R-E-Y rather than G-R-A-Y, but they do have kind of a palish, grayish tinge to their skin compared to our kind of skin. And they typically have the big blue eyes, tiny little nose, little mouth, and a very big cranium. And there are many of these gray types. Some of them are really short, like about 4 feet tall. Some are maybe 5'7" or 5'8" or 5'9". Some of them look like the gray type, and yet they're more of a tan color. Some are more of a white color. I think these are all different species of extraterrestrials that I'm talking about. Now, I bet a lot of you have heard of the early abduction case, probably the first one that became well known, the case of Betty and Barney Hill, who had an encounter in New Hampshire, driving along at night out in the countryside. And this is one of the beings whom Betty Hill and Barney too had an encounter with, and they described the being to an artist who did this particular rendition. So he's a gray being, but he was quite a tall gray being, probably about 5'10" or 11 inches tall. And this is a type that many, many people have encounters with. He's a gray, sort of a whitish gray being too, and again with the big black eyes, but he's a little bit more toward the human looking type of being. And this one, some of them are described as being very profoundly thoughtful and insightful, like this one. And none of them seem to speak with voices like we do. They all of these different types speak telepathically. And so the people who experience these encounters often hear in their minds, hear telepathically what the beings are saying. They actually have telepathic abilities. They say, the extraterrestrials say, that we all have telepathic abilities too, but we don't use them because we're taught from a very, very early age to speak with our voices and hear with our ears. But I do know some people who have a close enough relationship where they know each other's thoughts. And when they check it out verbally, they've been correct about the thoughts that they've been picking up. So apparently we all have that ability, but we just don't use it. But these beings do. So this being you see on the screen could be profoundly giving information or insight into the person. And then this being, have you ever heard of Bashar? Bashar is an extraterrestrial being. Actually, he calls himself a hybrid from 70,000 years in our future. It's a little hard to relate to, but he's a being who's channeled by a man up in the San Fernando Valley, Darrell Anka. Have any of you been familiar with that? Okay, some of you have. Anyway, he's a very wise being who gives all kinds of information, counsel, advice to people in the audiences that he channels to. And he has tremendous insight about being a human being and about specific human beings who are living right here now, who go to the audiences of these channelings. And he channeled through Daryl Anka, he channeled what he looks like. And this is what that being looks like. So over the 70,000 years from now, he has evolved into more of a gray being. There's a gray hybrid being, you know, partly human, but he used to be, all that time ago, he used to be a human being like us. Anyway, very, very wise, interesting being. And this little guy, little gray type, is one of the ones that many, many people see. And some of the gray types are considered to be more robotic. That's how they act and that's how they move. And they don't seem to have any emotional response at all. But some of the gray beings, like this one, seem to have more of a sweetness about them and more of an identification with what the person being taken for these experiences is feeling and experiencing. They seem to be more tuned in to emotion. That's one thing about a lot of the extraterrestrial types, is they don't seem to have the range of emotion that we have. And that's one of the reasons why the extraterrestrials are so fascinated by us, too, because we have so many emotions. I mean, just think of your one self, your own self, you know, how many different emotions we can go through in different situations. And that is miraculous to them because they don't have that component for feeling emotion the way that we do. And then we have types that look a little bit more extreme, but again, in so many cases, the cranium of the head is much larger. Presumably they have larger brains, and they're very, very much more intelligent in certain regards than we humans are. And typically they have the very big eyes. And another type, big, big head, different type of eyes, but as in so many cases, they seem to be completely black like that. But those eyes really are very piercingly keen. They see and sense probably way more than we do. It seems like they see and sense energy changes, for instance, more than most of us humans do. And then this type, now look at the hands that fold over at the wrists, and the large cranium as well, and big eyes. Those big eyes, again, see so much more than our eyes seem to see. And this one, now this one is a gray being, one of the many types of grays, and he has an instrument which he's going to be using. Now you notice the hands. Very often the beings will have 3 fingers, sometimes no thumb at all, and yet the other fingers are flexible enough to hold an object like this one is holding, and sometimes they do actually have thumbs. But this one is poised and ready to do something to a person, some kind of examination of some sort. And then this one, again, a huge head, huge eyes. Now this would not necessarily be very comforting to encounter, and yet some of these are really quite decent and can be helpful to the person, not just self-serving. And this one, some of them are very tall, very thin, many types, and a very, very long neck, as this one has, and practically all eyes, it seems like, in the head. And very often they don't wear clothing, or it certainly seems like they don't have clothing on, and sometimes they do. Other types typically do have. So this is some sort of a wraparound gown thing gathered up. Their clothes are usually different than the kind of clothes that we wear. And another one, this type has been described by some of my clients as looking severe, but actually very kindly and very caring about the people they have experiences with. Now, you've probably all heard about the Roswell Crash, the UFO crash back in 1947. And this was a model made to look like the original extraterrestrial beings who were in that Roswell UFO that crashed. And now, not very many people actually got to see those little aliens, but some of them did, and drew pictures right away. And then later on, this model was made for the UFO Museum that's in Roswell, New Mexico, looking very real, even with the injuries that were sustained when that UFO crashed. And then we have very tall beings who are more kindly and more caring. Look at the one on the right there. A very sweet being, according to the woman who experienced them. And they know so much about us, way, way more than we know about them. So one of the fascinations for me personally is to see how much we can know about them. But they do know they know about our thoughts, our feelings, our fear, our glories, our physical bodies, our emotions, our dreams, our hopes. You know, when they put attention into us, they know all of that. And when people have experiences with beings like that, they feel very known, more than they do by meeting each other. You know, we know that we all make certain impressions with other people, and that the people have opinions about us, but it's kind of guesswork in a way on our part. But when people are with beings like this, with eyes of this type, looking at them in complete focus, they feel really known throughout their whole being. And then here's a guy who looks a little bit different. There was some of them, there's kind of a reminiscent look, a bit like a human. Would you agree? And yet, obviously, this is not really a human being. But this is a more kindly type. It's very rare with people I've talked to, it's very rare for somebody to see any of these beings smile. They don't seem to have the musculature and the nerve situation that we have to have such changes of expressions. We have a lot of different expressions, don't we? And we can see that on each other's faces. This one is the closest that I've ever seen to a smile on the face of an extraterrestrial. But he has, I think you would agree, sort of a kindly look, sort of a softer look, more relatable with sort of look. Now this one is, I have been told, a photograph from some department of the government a photograph of a real live extraterrestrial being, one of the short gray types. And if that's true, I think we're very fortunate to have that photo. And here's another one, which is allegedly a real photo of one of the short gray extraterrestrial types, Zeta Reticula type. And here's an artist depiction. There's an artist named Cassara. Christine Dennett is her actual name. She goes by the artist named Cassara, and she has done hundreds of pictures of extraterrestrial beings from the descriptions given by experiencers of this phenomenon. And some people have seen, it's even come out in a few of my regressions, that have seen little beings landing in a craft, like you see in the background there, and studying our soil and our plant life. And we wonder if maybe they're looking not only on Earth, but possibly on other planets too, to see which planets would be able to sustain life if extraterrestrial life wanted to move there. But so they're not only interested in people, but they're interested in our animal life and in our growing life, our food, sustenance life as well. Now, this little guy, I think, is a real photograph of a little extraterrestrial. And I mentioned the woman whose children did the Reiki healing, and she worked with me for many regressions during a period of 11 years. And about the middle year of our work together, I happened to get hold of this picture, and I showed it to her one day in our session, and she said, "Oh, where did you get this photograph? That's one of the three little white guys who always came and took me away for each experience I had." And they were the three little white guys. They looked, little short guys, they looked identical to each other, but the middle one somehow was her favorite. She really liked these little guys. This woman, from earliest childhood, shared a room with her sister, whom I came to know, and the sister was a witness again and again, many times, when they would wake up in the middle of the night and there'd be little sparkles of light coming into the room from the window, and they would make little circles and do like little somersaults and do patterns in the air. They thought the little circles were of light were angels. And they used to say to their mother, "Oh, you've got to come in and see the little angels. They're so sweet. They're so cute." And the mother would say, "No, I don't need to get up in the middle of the night and come and see the little angels, because angels are only for children to see." So she never did come in and witness that, but the sister did. And these little sparkles of light would eventually, after flying around the room, filling up the air, they would coalesce into more of a ball of light, and then that would coalesce into the three little beings like this. So my client loved, really welcomed these three little beings, and whatever kind of experience she was being taken to with a whole variety of different extraterrestrial beings, it was always the three little white guys who would come and escort her to those experiences and bring her back. And she felt that they were very dear friends. So this one, she said, looks exactly like the three little white guys. In this case, were white rather than gray, and but very similar to the gray alien look, and the long fingers, no thumb, and round eyes. She liked the little white guys better than the ones with the big black eyes she would see on the ships, because the ones with round eyes seemed to have expressiveness in their eyes. They moved, and they conveyed different feelings, including a very friendly feeling. So they didn't have the musculature to smile, but their eyes said the smile. They conveyed that sense. So I think this picture is precious. It was actually well, I consider it a photo, but printed in an aerospace magazine, I think for an oil company. But I think it is a real photo. And then we have very different types, like very short types with a hood. Many people see extraterrestrials with a hood and the wrinkled face. This type often has been seen, as in this picture, working with somebody's feet. So this type of being will be seen down at the foot of the bed, working with the feet, sometimes touching the feet, sometimes reading the markings on the sole of the feet, like we have hand analysis, who will read the palm of the hand, but they seem to be able to get quite a bit of information through reading the bottom of the feet. And then here's a woman referred to as a pepperhead, because it's kind of like a green pepper, although not green. And she is holding a little girl. The little girl, as a woman, was one of my clients in regression. And she remembers experiences of being held and cradled and rocked by this kind of being, whom she said didn't look like a soft, loving being, but really was a soft, loving, caring being. So as a little girl, she was happy to be taken and to have association with this kind of very tall female being. And then you've probably all heard of implants, little objects that are put in the body of people who experience these encounters. And implants can be put anywhere in the human body. I've had so many people who've come to me and said, look, I have a little implant in my hand or in my arm or in my leg or in my abdomen or behind my ear, and you can feel a little bump under the skin. And some people have had them in their jaw or in a tooth or between the big toe and the next toe in one of the feet. They can be just about anywhere. And typically, it happens a lot that an experiencer, as I call them rather than abductees, an experiencer will have an implant inserted up the nose and into the third eye area, or sometimes behind an eye. This is done during one of these encounters. The person does not have to feel the pain of that as it's happening because they are switched off out of consciousness. And the implants seem to be for a whole variety of purposes. I think a typical thought about the implants is that they are used as tracking devices. In other words, wherever the person goes with the implant, go on a trip to another part of the United States or another country, another part of the world, that when it's time for the beings to visit that person again. They will know where the person is. We even have that kind of tracking device for our animals, or they could be used for people just as well. We know that that exists. And then sometimes people feel that the implant is a way of the beings giving information to them. And also, some people feel that the implant is a way of the beings getting information from the person. And the woman with the little boy and cousin, those people, that woman said that her implant, which is right up here in her forehead, that when a being is going to be coming a few hours later and taking her for an experience, when that's going to be happening, in other words, a few hours ahead of time, she will feel like an electrical current running across her forehead and ending there in that implant, like back and forth. And for her, she's learned that that means that within a few hours, she will be having a visit and having one of these encounters. And that's kind of handy for her, actually, because she said, oh, okay, well then, I won't plan to do any important event at that time. I'll just stay home tonight and take it easy, and because the experience is going to be happening. Now, this is a very unusual and interesting feature, that the being will often look right into the eyes of the human being, and the person experiencing this will say that it feels like, with these big eyes looking deeply into his eyes, that everything about this person is being known. The person is being known thoroughly, like everything about that person, the whole history of the life of that person, all the thoughts, all the feelings that have been piled up, including what they're experiencing while this is going on. And so people feel they are completely known. They never experience anything nearly to that extent by any other human being, but they do by this extraterrestrial being. So some people take that as, oh, this is really an incredible invasion of my personal privacy. And other people feel, wow, how interesting, that's, oh. But it's not that all the memories and who they are is being withdrawn from them. No, it's just being seen, it's being known, but everything is left intact. And I've regressed clients to that type of experience, and some of them have tried to do it the other way. In other words, really see if they can see into the eyes of the being who's staring into their eyes, and they said they just can't seem to penetrate, can't seem to get into those eyes while they're feeling like they are being completely known. And in one regression, the person said to the being, I want to see what's in your eyes. And the being said, if you could look in our eyes, it would be so different. You'd have no way of understanding what you're seeing. So it seems to be very much of a one-way street. What they do with that information, we don't know, but it's extraordinary that they have that ability. And then there's another procedure that is done sometimes by the beings of giving information non-verbally. They seem to be sending telepathically all kinds of information through the eyes and into the brain of that person. So sometimes that happens in person, individually, and during one of these encounters. And sometimes this downloading of information from the being seems to happen in a different setting when the person's not in an actual encounter or abduction. In other words, somebody might be deeply, deeply asleep. I've known of a few cases like this, so deeply asleep that the person cannot be awakened by other people around that person. And during that deep, what seems like an incredibly deep sleep, almost an unconscious state, the person in the meantime is receiving a download of lots and lots of information. And I have come to know certain aerospace engineers in my life. I know a few of them right now, for instance. And in inventing a very complicated machinery, sometimes they will be downloaded with information, not just when they're asleep, but when they're sitting right at their desk. And we know of composers and artists and so forth, who create with what they're being downloaded. It happens now. So I think there are all kinds of sources in the case of musicians and artists, poets, writers. For instance, it may be other kinds of beings whom we don't consider extraterrestrial, but more like spirit beings, spiritual beings, other dimensional beings who are doing the inspiring and the downloading of information. But some people get that information coming in directly from extraterrestrials. Now, this was one of my personal experiences. I've had 4 that I know of, where my car, my good old Subaru wagon, and I were taken from the 101 freeway, coming down from Santa Barbara at midnight one night down toward Ventura. And there was a big flash of light in front of my windshield. And then the next thing I knew, although I had to have this come out in regression, I knew the flash of light, and I knew that the windshield was cracked. And there were other peculiar things like no traffic at all, either way, on the freeway. So I wondered about that as I was driving along. But anyway, my car and I were taken, and I was escorted out of my car, which was locked, by a lot of these little beings whom I thought were adorable, like little curious children. I just got such a kick out of them, even though this was a very mysterious experience. And they ushered me out of my car, across what seemed like almost a garage room, an empty room on the spacecraft, into a door, into another room, and sat in a chair with a column coming up the back of it, and on the top of the column was kind of a metal thing looking like that pointed thing, like a helmet, sort of. And they lowered that down, fitted it around my head, as that being is doing. And then all the little beings, probably about 20 or 30 of them, looking exactly like each other, were all around, just looking at me, big eyes, so curious looking, joggling each other to get a little bit closer. And anyway, I have just got a tremendous kick out of it. And then I felt a current coming through me, sitting in the very hard chair with arms. And then I noticed a tall white being across the room ahead of me, in front of me. And he said, "Ah, you probably wonder what we're doing." He said, that current is not harming you. We are just taking information from your brain, taking information about all that you know from the people you have worked with who've had experiences with beings like us and many other kinds of beings. Now, during that regression on me, Dolores Cannon, do some of you know of Dolores Cannon? She's written many wonderful books and started a whole regression therapy healing technique. A wonderful woman who died about 3 years ago now, but we were good friends. And she was conducting the regression on me. And she said, what do you do with that information you're downloading? And the being said, we broadcast it. And she said, well, how do you do that? And she kept asking questions through me, and I would ask it to the being and the regression. And after a while, he said, she doesn't need to ask questions through you. She can just ask them, I'll hear her, and I'll answer them through you, through me. And so we went on. She eventually wrote all that information in the last 2 chapters of one of her books. This book was called The Custodians by Dolores Cannon. Very interesting book about other people's extraterrestrial encounters, including this one, with lots of information about that particular species of extraterrestrials and their kind of life, their consciousness, and so forth. And so anyway, it was a very, very, very interesting, and I would say positive experience. We did 2 regressions to that one experience because the being was giving us so much information and we were so fascinated with it. So here's another kind of being with skin that is so almost transparent that you can see the nerve structure underneath. And this kind, I include this because sometimes children are encountered by beings who try to look friendly. They try to disguise themselves as a clown, assuming that children like clowns. That's not true. I didn't like clowns when I was a kid. Many people don't, but they seem to assume that children laugh and smile and get a kick out of clowns, and so they try to disguise themselves that way. But this is really just a good old gray alien, as you can see. And then some have sort of a wrinkled brow. There's more of a gray type, but this a taller type. And then there are a number of different types of very tall, very thin white beings, and they're often described as having the skin pulled so tightly over their structure that it's almost as if they're skeleton looking or skull looking, but yet there is some flesh there. And this type of being often tends to be a mentor type of being, educating a person over a lifetime. And this being, one of my clients said, he does not look like a friendly, nice type of being, but he really was a lovely, lovely being who was very kindly. That's rather a different type than what we usually see. Now, this being was the lifelong mentor, teacher, guide, extraterrestrial, to that woman who had the little children who did the space Reiki healing on her, the woman I worked with for 11 years. And she very often had encounters with this being. She also frequently channeled this being in my office. So I got to have, so fortunate, I got to have many, many conversations with him during that period of 11 years until she moved away, and then I lost contact with her. But this was a very nice being, totally white skin, hair that had a little bit of slight yellow in it, but very, very light, almost white. He was very tall, very thin, always communicated with her telepathically. And anyway, she was very, very fond of him. I am very fond of him as well. Now, Kasara did a picture here. You've got the little beings down here. So this is a crowd of people walking along a sidewalk. And the point was that there are other beings sometimes who come and in the light of day intermingle with us, like these two right here. And this type, that's an extraterrestrial, and this is too. Now this is a regular human being walking through the crowd in a city, and she's noticing, she's looking back at these beings like, wow, they're different looking. And once in a while, I meet somebody who says that they actually have seen somebody who they have the impression of is not really human. And I saw one of these in a coffee shop about 4 years ago, coffee shop up in Claremont, and I was just freaked out. To put it mildly, I was stunned and fascinated, and I wanted so much to get up from my seat and go over and talk to that person. I just saw her walk by, and I couldn't. I just couldn't. I don't know if there was something about her that made me not able to move and to get up and talk to her, or if it was my own reaction. I still wish I had. And how are you? How are you tonight? How, where are you from? Well, I'm from, Alpha Centauri or whatever. But anyway, I never did. Now, these are tall, white beings. Do any of you know of the beings that Charles Hall had experiences with? I see a nod over here. Charles Hall was a meteorologist who worked up in the high desert out past Area 51. I think it was in the China Lake area. He lived there for a few years doing meteorological work. And there were these tall, white extraterrestrial beings who came in from their own planet in a spaceship like you see up here. Here are the mountains at the edge of the desert. And our government actually has a big hangar for spacecraft that come in from other planets. It's built into this mountain range here. And these tall whites would come in, and their ships would be sort of repaired if need be and refurbished, and they would live there for a while. And he lived in a little house way out in the desert by itself, and these tall whites would come in. They're usually like 7, 8 feet tall, sometimes 9 feet tall, very tall and thin, pure white, and they would just appear in his house or in his yard. Like he'd get up in the morning, walk into the kitchen of his little house, and there they'd be, a couple of these tall whites looking in his cupboard and taking out the cans and looking at the food and sort of just checking things out. He said they were quite friendly and quite nice, and he learned after a while how to communicate with them. And these beings, I think this is so fascinating, these beings would often, or not often, but once in a while would be seen in Las Vegas, which was about 45 minutes or an hour away from this sort of desert location. And they would be seen dressed up in human clothes going into some of the casinos. And recently, within the last 6 months, I regressed a woman who had been there in one of those casinos and had seen two of the tall whites, and they actually had an experience with the two beings. They were not abducted, taken away, but they were taken into another room in the casino, kind of like a storeroom, where there weren't any people, and were just sort of affected, impressed energetically by the two beings. They weren't harmed in any way. But anyway, that certainly was an interesting experience. So those are the tall whites. And then in the Roswell crash, you know, there were a few beings who were in that spacecraft, and one of them lived for a little while. The others were killed, but Don Schmidt, who did a lot of research about this and talked to some of the witnesses who saw those beings, that he drew these pictures to show what the beings in the Roswell crash had looked like. And here's a picture of the beings. This is by Bill McDonald, who's a forensic artist. He showed that they had their hands in these sort of keypad sort of things, and that they were piloting the ship basically by their thought, by their minds. Now, there are all kinds of beings. You can see the variety here. One with very long, shaggy hair, and the woman sitting here is a woman in one of my experiencer support groups. We were having a meditation out in somebody's patio, and this being came, and he rocked the chair that each one of us was sitting in, and she actually got a glimpse of him. And then sometimes they're reported to have big red eyes, and sometimes unusual craniums like this. And again, a different head shape. Sometimes the beings are seen to be glowing, and very often with a blue sort of light emanating from them. This particular being, my client was a woman from England, was sending out blue energy from his eyes, which was healing energy. And some of these with really, really big craniums, high and to the back. And the same woman from England had experiences sometimes with an Arcturian being who looked kind of like a cat type of being. And she described this being as being very wise, very knowing, very kindly. And then this is the Mothman in Virginia, I think it was. Charles Fort did a lot of work about that. And some people have considered this to be an extraterrestrial being, but it's still sort of a mystery, I think, as to what that being really was and where he came from. And a smaller edition of this. So people do occasionally here on Earth see very, very unusual beings like that. This one came from a government, US government document. It's one of the types of beings. And then there was a UFO crash in Varginha, Brazil, and there were 3 little guys with bright red eyes and little horns, little extraterrestrials that were affected in that crash. One of them died. One of them was found by school children hiding next to a stone wall, and was taken to a hospital, and whoever treated him got very, very, very sick with something unusual caught from him, and he died too. And then we have the Sasquatch, the Bigfoot, who many people consider are connected with UFOs. Their footprints are seen walking along, and then suddenly the footprints stop. And they've been seen, too, sometimes at a distance. A Bigfoot, a Sasquatch will be seen, and then suddenly the next second it's not there. It's as if they are taken up. One of the theories is they are taken up by a UFO, and they actually come from space and live here for a while, or they come in from another dimension. And this kind, the Doughboy or Pillsbury Doughboy type, has been seen with this very puffy sort of suit on. And then we get into the Insectoid types, or the mantis being types, usually very tall, 8 foot tall, 9 foot, 10 foot tall, and very big wraparound eyes, very, very thin. And this is a great depiction by Casara of one of these with the fold-over arms. They just fold like what would be our wrist. There's a whole appendage coming down. And these are very, very wise beings. I've heard lots of very positive reports about them. This is another one of the insectoid types of beings. And this one holding a little bird in his hand. And this insectoid, sometimes people who see them on the ship say that these seem to be the ones in charge of other things going on, like people being taught skills or people having medical examinations. And another depiction of an insectoid type. Katarina Wilson, a well-known experiencer, had many encounters with that type. And then somewhat shorter beetle-like types. I ran into one of these in a regression with a woman in England who had this type coming and taking blood from her. I don't mean great gallons of blood, I mean just a number of drops of blood, and was told by the being that there's a component in human blood that was help that species to live more healthily, and they would give it to their babies. Then we have the whole reptilian type of beings who come. They look very unpleasant. They usually have bright yellow eyes. They're good, bad, and the ugly of reptilians. Some of them are friendly and nice. Some of them are a little bit more imposing, a little bit less friendly. They seem to love to reproduce humans or hybrids with humans. Some of them love to get dressed up, be kind of mighty like that. This is my co-author Nadine Lalich's version of the reptilian that she saw many times on a ship. And she said he was an okay kind of guy. He wasn't really that frightening. I'm going to have to go really quickly here. Another reptilian type. Some of them seem to be very grandiose and full of themselves. Some of them seem to be more kindly. Here's another kind, sort of a reptilian type, an aquatic type. Some of them seem to actually live in our oceans. These seem to be reptilian beings from another planet, extraterrestrial, but very watery types, and little types, and even smaller types, more like a little frog. And then there's a swimmer type that one of my clients encountered in the ocean. So a whole variety, these with the more pointed heads. And then some of these species do reproductive programs and create the hybrids. I'll talk a little bit more about that this afternoon. These are tanks full of little hybrid babies being gestated. And here's another single one in a little gestation tank. And I will talk much more about this afternoon. This is the hybrid daughter of my co-author Nadine Lalich. This girl, hybrid girl, was about age 20 at the time when this was drawn. And other people who've had ET human hybrid children who live on the ships because they're not human enough to live here. Some of them have hair, it's usually straggly hair, or skimpy hair like this. So these are half ET, half human. And this one, of course, with the much less hair and a really big cranium. So I know the mothers have regressed the mothers who drew these pictures of their own hybrid children. And here's another one with the ET. And these are the reptilian human sons of one of my clients I worked with many, many times. We're just about finished, almost here. And then some of them are glowing, loving types, just radiating with light. And very, very kindly, this one appeared to a woman in Scandinavia, this type, and some of them are more human, more Nordic looking, we tend to call them, because they look Scandinavian, and yet they're extraterrestrial. And this type, another Nordic type, very human looking, but they don't have as much facial expressiveness as we do. These two allegedly came from the Pleiadians, and some of the Pleiadian species look very human-like. Depictions that look very Pleiadian, and these human. And then some people really welcome their ET contacts and actually call out for the ships to come in. Some people fear them very much, and some people really want those encounters. And this woman is meditating and receiving information, very positive information and inspiration from the extraterrestrials. And this is a Frenchman, actually, drew this picture of one of the beings, the more enlightened extraterrestrial beings, who frequently comes to him. And this one as well, he did this picture, a very more spiritually advanced being. And quickly, I'm going to show some of the very positive, spiritually inspiring beings. We could call them more angelic, or we could call them more extraterrestrial. But the main feature is that they are glowing with light always and have great healing abilities. So these are various artist depictions of these beings, extraterrestrial, spiritual. Sometimes it's hard to know exactly how to name them, but these are different types of beings that come to people sometimes, and they're very impressed with them. This is a council of enlightened beings and extraterrestrial beings. You can see some of the shorter ones there who look more typically what we think of as extraterrestrial, but these are all living off-planet. And infused and emanating with light. So people who have experiences with these are very pleased, very enlightened. Some of them much more human-looking than others, but all very loving, like unconditionally loving, that type. And even some of the ones who look more extraterrestrial and very different types than we are, exude that unconditional love. But particularly these, it's easier for us, of course, to relate to the ones who look more human-like, understandably. Loads of different types. Good old Nordic type. And these are beings who, a depiction of beings whom I saw in one experience. And then some people just notice it right by their bed at night. There's a glowing being. It's a glow, and they look into it and they see that in the middle of that glow is a being. Glowing beings, balls of light that emanate energy and light, and a being healing a person, and a healing process done on board one of the crafts by the extraterrestrial beings. And then, just at the very end here of the pictures, are the men in black. Very mysterious. They come often to UFO researchers who know a lot, or they come to experiencers of extraterrestrial contact. And they seem to want the people to not talk about this information or the experiences that they have. And this is the book over here, one of my 3 books about alien experiences, 24 cases, all of which are very different. The aim of this book was to give reassurance to people who experience this, and also to show 25 different kinds of experiences with different kinds of beings that people have, even though there are more than 25 types, but we had to draw the limit somewhere. Well, thank you very much for your attentiveness.
Thank you so much, Barbara.